Yes.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome to this seminar series today Professor Ira HARKAVY, an old friend and colleague of mine, Associate Vice President at University of Pennsylvania, more importantly, kind of founding director of the Barbara and Edward Neti Center for Community Partnerships at Penn, and written widely. He's been kind of co-edited and co-written 11 books, so it's somebody who's really kind of entrenched in what he'll be talking about today. You know, I began to work with Ira when he was asked to work with us on something called, by the Ford Foundation, on something called the CHESS program, which was Community and Higher Education Service Partnerships in South Africa, and we sort of got to know each other then. And then since then, sort of I've been involved in something called the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility and Democracy. And Ira is the chair of that and has been the chair of that for many, many years. He's also the chair of the Anchor Institutions Task Force, and he'll say something about that today, I'm sure. And more recently, that we've created something called the Global Cooperation for the Democratic Mission of Universities, and he chairs that as well. So I'm really pleased to welcome Ira today. He'll, as usual, he'll speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll have some Q&A that follows that. I need to just make one announcement, and that is that please note that the meeting is being recorded, and the recording of the dialogue will be uploaded on the Tokyo College YouTube channel later. If you participate in the Q&A session with your video on, your name and face will appear on the recorded video. If you prefer not to have your face and name appear, then please switch your video off and only your voice will then be heard. Okay, I had to make that announcement. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over to you. So would you like us to share your slides now? Or?
Sure, well, you can post them, that's fine. You can just put them up now. That would be fine. That would be fine. So
over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Ahmad, it is a great pleasure to see you, and I'm thrilled to be able to do this and to be invited to Tokyo College. It's an exciting opportunity to learn together and work, and it's always a pleasure to be with you and to work with you. As Ahmad indicated, we have been close colleagues since 1999 or so, and have continued working together. And I always learn from Ahmad and benefit from our association. So thanks to you and to Tokyo College. So what I'm going to be speaking on today is realizing the democratic mission of universities in a time of global crisis. And we can go to the next slide, please. I'd appreciate that. So if we talk about the crisis in democracy, the question is, what are its components? And part of these components became highly visible and real to us because of the development, of course, of COVID-19, which had a profoundly powerful impact on societies all over the world. What they revealed, COVID-19 in part, was something that was already happening, the increasing chasmatic economic, political, social, and educational health inequalities, certainly occurring in the United States, but occurring actually, of course, all over the world. And this development has been felt deeply and has deep impacts as it became more visible, but just in the fact of it. In a recent period also, there clearly has been increasing racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. As you may have heard just recently, a Nazi and two Nazis were going to, in fact, end the power across Baltimore in the United States, with the threat of ongoing racist and anti-Semitic and xenophobic violence in the United States, certainly in places all over the world. As we've seen, certainly, again in the United States, but more broadly, the attacks on science and knowledge, the idea of alternative facts, ideas of indicating that what your opinion is right, regardless of whether it is based on fact. Attacks on science, on knowledge, and democracy itself, the sense that there is a lack of in fact, belief that knowledge is, in fact, what the great philosopher Francis Bacon said is power for the relief of man's estate, to improve human life. Instead, there's an attack on ideas, on science, knowledge, and democracy. And there's a declining distrust, declining trust in almost every institution. All the studies show all institutions now have declined rapidly in the recent period. And certainly in the United States, the increasing lack of faith in institutions, the core institutions of society, are really dramatic. And I think I was seeing something that almost all of them now, except for the military, are viewed with skepticism in the United States. And this is happening all over the world. And examples of the kind of disinformation and destruction, of course, are in the armed insurrection in the US Capitol last year. And then, in fact, the somewhat imitative and also severely dangerous attempt to a violent uprising in Brazil, both attempts to overthrow electoral results and democratic results. But even with this sense of crises, there are certainly large-scale signs of hope. The demonstration in Iran and in China, the Brazilian and US elections. In the US case, no one thought, Ahmad and I were in communication then, and there was great worry. And it turned out to be much, much better than anyone could have expected. In fact, historically better. And of course, most sign of hope is the democratic countries of Europe being unified in their defense of the Ukraine and the Soviet invasion. So there are certainly possibilities. Next slide, please. So we'll go to the next slide if we could. And so the question is, what are the universities' role in this? And I think one of the issues is that the universities are incredibly significant institutions. They are, in fact, could be argued, as Derek Bach, the former president of Harvard, argued, probably the most influential institutions in the world, particularly in advanced societies like Japan and the United States. They develop new ideas and technologies. If you think about their role of engines of economic development, being centers of economic development nationally, globally, but also this idea of being anchor institutions rooted in their communities that become centers of both development, but also centers of cultural development, of technological development, of business development. The idea that they're rooted institutions with enormous impacts on their environment. But probably most important, they teach the teachers and the teachers' teachers. They are, in fact, the institutions that shape learning, that shape our values. William Rainey Harper, the president of University of Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, said universities, in spite of themselves, shape society. Universities, in spite of themselves, in fact, shape democracy, because they teach the teachers and the teachers' teachers. They educate people in all fields, in all areas, and they provide actually the center for the passing on of knowledge, the passing on of civic values. They represent the core institution in fact, doing that work. So that raises a question: if we're so influential, don't universities then have a role in helping to contribute to improving society? Don't they have a crucial role in trying to reverse the trends that were just described? Do the current developments signal those pessimistic 4 items that I indicated? Is there, in fact, a sense that universities perhaps are not doing what they should and they could? That is there a possibility, a sense that they are not contributing in the ways that they could and should to actually helping to solve or prevent those very problems that I outlined earlier? So go to the next slide, please. So if I were to look at the purposes of higher education, at least in the United States, and I still think these are crucially significant, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit. In the case of the United States, there seems to me 2 core purposes, the 2 that are most important. And I would argue that universities are not realizing their potential and not fulfilling the purposes that are indicated here. First is education for democratic citizenship. And I would actually argue that that is the primary of the two. Now I'm going to quote two people connected to my institution, to the University of Pennsylvania. As you may know, the University of Pennsylvania was founded by one Benjamin Franklin, one of the great founding parents of the United States of America. Great scientist, engineer, businessman, politician, writer, extraordinary, universally figure in terms of his impacts. Crucial role in the American Revolution, being ambassador to France, crucial to establishing the whole idea of the Democratic Republic in the United States, crucial in his work in relation to the printing press, to inventing, being the founder of the first libraries, just stunning, indicate power with the first founder of bifocals. I mean, one can go on, but he founded the University of Pennsylvania. And I would argue that's his greatest contribution. I'm a bit biased in that regard because I worked there, but he developed the university, and he established the idea that education for democratic citizenship, or citizenship at least, is core, where he wrote when he founded the university in a piece that described his purposes, that the purpose was to develop in young people an inclination, that's moral, joined with an ability intellectual, to serve mankind, human beings, one's country, friends, and families. And that idea of service, the inclination joined with an ability, should be the great aim and end of all learning. It was the first, probably secular institution of higher education, and it's certainly the first one to emphasize service as its purpose. In the United States, all the preceding universities were founded with religious purposes related to service. But he said this is the core function, and I would argue that's core to institutions of higher learning. And then the other idea is knowledge to advance the human condition, advancing knowledge, the research function. And that I'm quoting W.E.B. Du Bois, another great figure in the United States history, an African-American sociologist who is crucial to both writings and powerful works such as the Philadelphia Negro, but also for organizing, for social change, and for equality in the United States. A great intellectual figure. While he was at the University of Pennsylvania, he wrote the Philadelphia Negro, and he said the purpose of that book was to serve as the scientific basis of further study and practical reform, changing the world. That idea of the Enlightenment, knowledge to improve the world. So I would take those are the two purposes, and I would argue that higher education has not made those made those purposes as central as they could and should. Next slide, please. And now it seems to me that what we have is certain types of universities roughly presented that capture what is being done, and then what could and should be done. And I've divided this into three components. The first is traditional liberal arts institution, and the second, neoliberal entrepreneurial university, and the third, the democratic civic university, is the other one that I highlighted. The traditional liberal arts institution university, which still holds great power on that, represents in many regards an idea of education for elite status. It's education for elite leadership. It has almost a kind of Platonic orientation, of philosopher kings, knowing more, knowing a lot about things. And certainly it does have a component of learning about citizenship and becoming a citizen, but very much led by leaders, and always had an orientation of exclusivity and exclusion. Now, I'm a big supporter of liberal arts. I'm a trained historian. I've teaching in the arts and sciences, among other schools. I teach in two other schools, but I teach primarily in the School of Arts and Sciences. However, what is needed, I would argue, is a liberal arts that serves to be powerfully connected to the world, an idea of a new liberal arts that helps with problem solving and ideas. And John Dewey, the great philosopher and educational theorist and educational practitioner, indicated what we need is not a philosophy for philosophers, but a philosophy and, in fact, the liberal arts for human beings that help, and that's what's needed. But we have a traditional liberal arts. Increasingly, and this is certainly a development over the last 30 years, universities have developed an approach that might be called neoliberal entrepreneurial university. And that approach sees, in fact, the exclusive purpose, the exclusive primary purpose, education for jobs and economic success. Doesn't look to education for personal development or education for intellectual development, and nor education for advancement of knowledge, and certainly not education for citizenship, but rather economic focus. It has the idea of students as customers, of education for profit, not for the public good. It has as a focus the idea of education as being, in fact, a source of profit making, and that universities are in themselves largely profit-making institutions or institutions dedicated to the values of the marketplace. The idea of education for democracy is minimized, even education for knowledge for its own sake, but the idea of educating undergraduates with the primary, if not the exclusive purpose of education for, again, economic success, and a focus on the university functioning as essentially a neoliberal university is become very significant, although in the United States being pushed back a bit by the current President Biden and his administration. But then the idea that needs to happen is emphasizing those purposes of education for citizenship and education for the advancement of knowledge to improve human life, to develop what might be called a democratic civic university. And strongly stated, which this does, it makes its primary purpose not knowledge for its own sake, which might be traditional liberal arts, not knowledge for economic success, which might be neoliberal entrepreneurial university, but in fact, the primary mission of the university would be advancing democracy, democratically, but democratically on campus, but also in the community and across the wider society. The idea of this becoming the primary mission as advancing democracy, not just as a theory, but doing it democratically in the real world, in the real life of communities, of neighborhoods, real life of campus, and in the wider society. Next slide, please. And to create the Democratic Civic University, I turn to a focus that I've worked on for a long time, and my dear colleague has also, the idea of the necessity of working in partnerships. And that argues in the first instance, the idea of that we work with the communities of which we are a part of, not a part from, but a part of. And we do that very much rooted primarily, but not exclusively, but significantly might be a better term, in partnerships with our local community. It means we work together to improve the quality of life in the environment, as well as the quality of learning, research, and teaching on campus, as well as the quality of learning for students in the community. Democratic Civic University would also be focused significantly on creating an inclusive, diverse, and equitable campus. That means that the campus itself becomes an exemplification of including all different groups, of having a diverse environment of different racial, ethnic, economic groups, and of an equitable campus in which all people are treated fairly and decently and justly. It's just exactly what we work on in the wider society. And a means for doing that, is the idea that focus on community, that focus on neighborhood, that focus on locality, is the focusing on what might be called universal problems manifested locally. What does that mean? It means that it focuses on problems such as racism, such as economic injustice, such as poor schooling, such as inadequate health care, issues such as a degraded environment. These are not problems exclusive to my university and its community of West Philadelphia. They're not the exclusive province of University of Natal and the work that Ahmad did in Durban. It is not the province of Tokyo College and the city of Tokyo. These are, in fact, universal problems all over the world that are manifested locally, and that the argument here is that universities should focus on those universal problems and make a real difference in the quality of life in the communities, a real difference as a way of learning, as a real difference as a way of being able to judge the impact of their work, a real difference by bringing together faculty, students, and staff together, working with communities on universal problems that happen in Tokyo, Philadelphia, Johannesburg, New York, Mexico City. These are the most significant, I would argue, problems of our time. The institution also should focus on the issue of an anti-racism and justice seeking, that it has values that are important to the overall orientation, not values that are hammered and presented as you have to believe this, but rather there's an orientation to create a more just world, anti-racism. And a point I made earlier about democratic purpose, process, and product. What does that mean? It means that in order to do this work, there has to be a democratic purpose, that we agree, we work with our community to improve and advance democratic life. And there's a democratic process, which means we learn with and from our neighbors. It means that there's transparency with our neighbors. There's a process in which we treat the members of the community not as means to an end, that we'll work with you because we have a grant. No, to the contrary, that they are ends in themselves, that we work with our neighbors and have a democratic process where we treat our neighbors and people we work with as having inherent value. And the idea of a democratic product is that both the community and the university improve. That the product is not just to help the community, not just to help the university, but mutuality. And lastly, there's a theory of knowledge production, epistemology behind this, that what we need is a community of experts. We can't solve these problems if we do them in isolation, only by doing them together, only by bringing the expertise of the community on the ground knowledge along with the university. And that's things that we focus on. Next slide, please. So to give a brief summary of the Neti Center, which I'm the founding director of and is celebrating its 30th anniversary, we have three components that I'll just describe relatively briefly, but important to understand how we try to actualize or advance the Democratic Civic University. I want to make this clear. We are a component, a fairly large component, a fairly large center at the university, but we are not the whole university. So when I say this, there's support for this, but it does not represent the entire university's work. Academically based community service is an approach to learning similar to what might be termed service learning, but a bit differently. It's a building into academic courses to help the community as far as credit-bearing courses across multiple fields, but with the idea that they are not just for student learning, they're for actually solving problems. So what that might mean is we might have a course that works in the area of linguistics, language development, in which we help people in the community of West Philadelphia learn reading better through using linguistic principles, a leading sociolinguist focusing on this work, in which he uses local neighborhood history and culture and hip-hop rhythm to teach standard English. It might be a course that we have in science, that Amma and I have talked about these, in neuroscience, called Everyday Neuroscience, in which a faculty member works with students who learn in the college, in the university, learn neuroscience by teaching it in the community. They run experiments. They improve as neuroscientists. Simultaneously, there's an improvement of the learning of students who in these poor, disadvantaged schools would never have the opportunity to learn neuroscience. It would just not happen, and they do in these contexts. It could be from a course using in English, using the work of August Wilson, for instance, a great writer who writes about Pittsburgh, another city in Pennsylvania, but that these school children and community members work with Penn faculty and students, and develop plays like August Wilson did, but focusing on West Philadelphia, our community, and then perform it. We have about 70 of these courses with about 3,700, 1,800 students in academically based community service courses across every field, from music to math to medicine, all across the university, 11 of the university's 12 schools. And then the other idea is the idea of university-assisted community schools. This is an idea that comes out of the history, actually the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, the idea of community schools, that they should be centers of neighborhoods and they should engage the entire population. It comes out of also the work of John Dewey, the great, again, philosopher and educational theorist and writer, and the work he did with a great settlement house leader, Jane Addams. And their notion of community schools was schools should be hubs of neighborhoods, involve children and adults. And what we added to that idea is we combined Dewey's idea of how you learn and said, young people, it shouldn't just be a center of a neighborhood. It should be that young people would learn by solving problems in the community, like improving healthcare is one example. And then we said that universities should be the core partner, should be central to that work. And university-assisted community schools, we bring together those academically based community service courses, because you can't solve these very difficult, as they often say, wicked, complex problems in single approaches. They have to be brought together as people live, and university-assisted community schools do that. They bring the core, but they also bring together, in our case, about 1,800 volunteers, students who work in federal work programs called work studies and other activities. So we bring about 3,000 students and let's say 100 faculty members working with 8 university-assisted community schools and 3,700 people in the community, children and their parents. So it's the idea of aggregating and integrating resources, including academically based community service. Now we work with nonprofit organizations and NGOs of all sorts, faith organizations, but this is our primary focus. And last is the approach of a democratic anchor institution. And that's an idea I've already touched on. The idea is that large institutions such as universities, medical centers, performing arts centers are rooted institutions. They're not going anywhere. They're embedded in their neighborhood, but they can just be there as anchors. And the question is, universities have a lot of things to offer. They have often one of the biggest employers. In Philadelphia, we're the largest employer besides the government. In fact, we're the largest private employer besides the Walmart in the whole state of Pennsylvania, because we have a large medical center and a large university. Largest purchases of goods and services, centers of real estate, as I talked about, arts and culture, but the question of doing it democratically, of working with the community, learning with community, learning from them and doing it for the community. So there's a mutuality. And the idea is that these two approaches, academically based community service and university-assisted community schools, are part of an attempt to have the University of Pennsylvania function as a democratic anchor. We're not there yet. We are not there yet, but this is crucial in terms of all the resources, comprehensively, the institutional and the academic resources coming together to make this difference. So next slide, please. So the question that faces us is that where do we go from here? Now, I've indicated my diagnosis might be wrong, but my diagnosis is universities are not realizing their promise. They're not realizing it for the sake of society and for their own benefit, that they would be greater institutions if they did this. So how would we take things forward? One issue is to have a searching critique. In the United States context, almost all higher education institutions, except private institutions, not private, for-profit institutions, but public and private institutions were founded for that idea of service and knowledge to improve the world. How are we doing? Searching critique. Are we saying things and is it a tinge of hypocrisy? We say it, but we don't really do it. That's one thing, to raise a critique. The other is that I've begun to outline to focus on place-based work work in the locality, in the neighborhood, in the region, in the local community. Focus on developing partnerships in the locality would be a powerful way to make a difference, and encouraging work that focuses on the needs and resources of the community and the needs and resources in the university. Those local partnerships that we actually can aggregate resources, bring great levels of trust, ongoing work, and can judge whether we're actually making a difference in the community and the wider society. We should start supporting universities based on the Noah principle. That's Noah in the Bible. The idea is no more prizes for predicting rain, prizes for building the arks. No awards on speculation, on speculative. Yes, eventually this is going to happen and we're predicting this. No, awards go to those who do. As they would say in the United States, those who walk the walk and not just talk the talk. The Noah principle. And last is to begin to work on something that Ahmad and I have been working on and keep pushing it, locally rooted global movement. Rooted locality, because this can't be solved in one country. We need each other. These are really hard problems. We require, as my friend Ahmad Bauer also says, a reimagining of the knowledge project. But that only can occur by connecting local to national to global. Next slide, please. And one example of that is what Ahmad referred to at the beginning of my talk, is the kind of global cooperation that is being created. We began this as a transatlantic project, which soon involved South Africa. They were the first non-European and US partner. And we began in 1999. I think South Africa joined in 2000. So it was very soon after the trip I had to South Africa, working with the Chess Project. We began to discuss these ideas. And the project engages bringing universities and colleagues all over now the world to advance the democratic mission of higher education on campus, in the community, and the wider society. And over time, we brought not just the Council of Europe, which is the leading entity, the first one that began this work in 1999 and engages now about 50 European countries, but also with a group, the third one, the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility, and Democracy, which involves the United States, South Africa, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Ireland. And then the International Association, which involves universities all over the world, and the Organization of American States, which involves 35 universities, mostly in Latin America and the Caribbean, a few in North America, as the United States and Canada, to come together and to have meetings, conferences, papers, books, to encourage this work and spread the word and develop new ideas. We just had an enormously successful meeting in Dublin, and focusing on bringing this global cooperation, which by 2021 added not just the International Consortium and the Council, but brought in the International Association of Universities and Organization of American States to have a new entity that encompasses these work further, and crucial to that idea of creating a movement that pushes this work and so on. Last slide, please. So what I'm really arguing for is, and this is is taking an idea that the great, again, philosopher and educational theorist and educator emphasized, America's greatest intellectual, John Dewey, emphasized in the book he wrote in 1927, in which he said, democracy must begin at home, and its home is the neighborly community. It's in the neighborhood. Can't have democracy isn't just about voting, it's about lived experience, or what Dewey called democracy of a way of life. And what I'm arguing for is a change of that Deweyan proposition. It's to going in a direction to realize Dewey's idea in practice. And I would argue now, and increasingly, we can begin to advocate for this, that democracy must begin at home. Democracy must begin at home, as Dewey said, and its home is the neighborly democratic civic university and its local community partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ira. And as usual, sort of just captured all the stuff with great passion. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
So we'll take some questions, but let me, as we're waiting for people to sort of gather their thoughts together, let me just kick off with a couple of questions. I think we are in a very difficult geopolitical situation now, right? With regard to kind of the shifts that are taking place, the sort of the emergence of a new Cold War and so on.
Right, new Cold War related to what's happening with the Ukraine and so on. Yeah.
Do you think that this is going to kind of apply pressure on universities to kind of close in on themselves and in their nations and so on? Is that a danger, do you think?
There is certainly a danger of, I put it two ways. The dangers are, it seems to me, have two possibilities. One is, and then I think what the opportunity is. One of the dangers that the Ukraine situation poses is the idea that you stick to your knitting, you do what you're used to do, you avoid the world. Now, where that happens also can be in autocratic societies, where as the rectors in Russia signed a statement early on saying our purpose is support of the state. So it also can be created two ways. One is a retreat because there's a fear, and then the other one is, in fact, a government emphasized retreat. That is when, particularly in autocratic societies, which frees universities, freezes them, not frees them, freezes them, makes them unable to move forward. Where this creates an opportunity is, it is clear, as was experienced in the meeting I referred to in Dublin, that universities are crucial for the democratic project. And under threat, what do they do? Under threat, what do they do? So there is the other side, plus the possibility that young people see this as a deep and profound threat, and therefore push their universities to be more engaged. But I do agree that all of these opportunities pose also dangers. So there is a possibility, certainly, of a retreat, of a sense of defeatism, that nothing can happen. And the second approach could be actually, which is occurring, a focus of autocratic societies on clamping down on universities, as has already happened in Russia.
Thank you. If there are any questions, colleagues, please just put your hands up so we can take your questions. Let me push on. As you know, I've been arguing quite strongly that we have to think quite hard about the work we do on democracy building, together with kind of a renewed emphasis of the role of universities in building a social justice agenda. In the case of South Africa, that's really a huge challenge for South Africa, because, in a sense, the democracy is not delivering. Right?
Yes, yes.
So do the ideas on, say, on the anchor institutions approach and so on, do they need a kind of social justice framework?
I think it's a very important question. I think that I'll put it, first of all, in a simple answer and then more complex. So the Anchor Institutions Task Force, which I'm founding chair of, has those principles built in. So there is a lot of work on anchor institutions that do not have that value framework. The Anchor Institutions Task Force emphasizes social justice and equity as one of four core principles. The others is democracy and democratic practice. The third is mutual benefit, with the idea, and the fourth is place-based. And if you take out and just say place-based or just mutual benefit, and not talk about social justice and equity, and do not speak about democracy and democratic practice, there is a danger, because the very major purpose of improving the world and reaching what I would term these universal values gets cut off, and you become entirely focused on more self-interested activity. Mutual benefit alone will not get you there. You have to have it. Now, the more broad response to that very good question. I think the issue, and with certainly in South Africa, but also it should be in the United States, but certainly it's very clear in South Africa, and is increasingly clear, I think, in the United States, is that the issue of social justice and is really fundamental to the effective functioning of the universities. And that if they do not, the people who are excluded, the anger, the lack of support, the failure of the society to deliver, the universities to be successful have to be on the side of helping to improve the quality of life of people. One can even argue that one reason that in rural America, Trump had such power and support was that there was not an engagement, and it's also less universities. The education level is less, but also universities were not seen as supportive of the needs of those communities. So it can lead to either a kind of extremism on different sides of the coin. And what it does is it can lead to what you face in part, not just a decolonization, but a fear of deinstitutionalization of universities. So for universities to get support, to prove their mettle, to prove the Enlightenment idea, they have to focus now on issues of social justice. Knowledge for its own sake will not get us there, will not get us there. In fact, I'll give a quick quote. Jane Addams said, in the turn of the 20th century, she said, when universities when colleges were founded, they were religious institutions, and they were judged by how effective they were, not by how much holy they were, but by how many people turned to God. When universities became secular, their purpose should be alleviating human suffering. Instead, they focused on knowledge for its own sake. A means has become an end, and they have lost their way. We cannot afford a century and a quarter after Jane Addams to keep losing our way, because then we'll lose our way. We will lose our institutions and how we function. So I agree very strongly with what you're saying.
So, colleagues, please put your hands up if you want to ask a question or make a comment. But let me push ahead. I mean, I like your notion of searching critique, right? Because it's also about universities taking stock, you know.
Yes, yes.
And, you know, I think I pointed out to you before, you know, that you know, during the student uprisings in 2015, 2017 in South Africa, one of the things that emerged on a regular basis was the complicity of universities in producing sort of democracies and producing inequalities and so on. So would you like to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think that there's a very interesting issue about that. So searching critiques have to be, though, connected, in my judgment, to the possibility that would occur if you did what you should do. So the searching critique needs to call the question. Given what our purposes are, what are we doing? So in the United States, how much is the University of Pennsylvania realizing Franklin's vision of an inclination, enjoyment, and ability to serve? How much are the founding of those principles being realized? So if in one is, and how much are the principles of the society? So at one level, there is a searching critique, but part of the critique is to indicate you're not fulfilling and realizing your purpose. So one can take that from struggles in civil rights. So, you know, Dr. King's famous speech, I have a dream. He was saying America made a promise, and it came back insufficient funds. It's not fulfilling, not realizing it. So it's for universities, it's holding up what their values and goals are. In most cases, they are humane, and indicating they're not being reached, not being done, and there is an alternative. So I think a searching critique is crucial to point out complicity and to some level culpability, but then to go beyond that to say, aha, if you weren't hypocritical, look what you could do. There's a way out. So it's not just damning them, but it's in fact saying, you have a problem, you have been contributing. And that's true in the United States, certainly, in terms of universities supporting both racism and slavery, but then what's to be done now? It's having a way that the past can help inform a better future. And again, starting with what Dewey said, the true starting point of history is some present problem in its situation. There is a deep problem. We are not doing well with it. What can we do in terms of learning from our history and the current situation to make a better university? I think that's very important. I think you're on mute. Ahmad, you're on mute.
Thank you. Trent, please come in.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you, Trent.
It's sort of, I mean, it's really inspiring to hear when universities do this of their own accord. But for the most part, they don't, right? For the most part, universities are neoliberal institutions, right, and are thinking about their financial bottom line.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the politics of this project of democratizing universities, like what role do student movements and trade unions play, or other actors? Where are the pressure points?
I mean, that's a great point, Trent, and I'll put it even this way. What I didn't mean to say was this was just an institutional response. So, and I'll get to students momentarily. I think that there is an issue to call the question on faculty colleagues. You see, I think that the issue of universities being neoliberal or traditional liberal arts is also raising questions with our colleagues about what their academic work is about. I mean, some of the movement that I've been part of, and not the work that Amma and I are part of, but I mean work around it, at least in areas of other groups of colleagues, they emphasize only in the economic issue. So what they emphasize, in fact, is my institution is enormously rich in a poor community, and there is pressure. But that pressure will not produce significant change, even if university puts millions and millions of dollars in, because there's no agency, there's no learning, there's not fulfilling the core purposes of the university. And for that to happen, there needs to be a question called, in terms of faculty work, raising the issue of in getting them to be engaged in this. And one of the pressure points are other activist faculty and people who write and teach in these areas. And one reason, besides my liking it, that I published with other colleagues, Nama and I have written together in books a number of times, is to, in fact, not because we both think it's important, which we do, we enjoy doing it, but also because it is a way to show that this is powerful academic work. So the issue is, one pressure point is pointing out that what might be termed community engaged scholarship or democratic implementation research can be across fields and disciplines, even as far afield as people who are theoretical physicists on that, like Ahmad. So the idea is that there are all these potentials that are very real. This second issue, it seems to me, is another pressure point are the students. And that comes both from student movements, but also student pressure on their own campus related to how they're taught and what they learn. How they're taught, not just what they learn, but how they're taught. And I can tell you, although it hasn't been student movement, but student activity has been absolutely central in moving faculty in the University of Pennsylvania to support the work of the Neti Center. It has been students taking courses, being part of student committee on undergraduate education, pointing to this work, graduate students doing this research, calling the question in a way, saying this is great work, and them doing good work, this is the work we want to do. So besides the student movement calling it, the question is also students in their everyday activity, those who are activist oriented being involved, it seems to me is absolutely crucial. And the third issue is the community itself, that the pressures from the community to do this, the kind of issue of losing support, the kind of political loss of support, and the kind of gains that occur to an institution when it does these things. And part of the pressure are forming partnerships between the university faculty and students and centers like Neti, which they work with, and the community. That part of the pressure is you need community partners. It can't be just inside the house. It has to be together, and that adds power. So I think that's crucial. And I think, again, a general student movement calling the question would be wonderful. The problem with some of that activity, it depends where it lands, because some just emphasize economic remediation. And that really will not lead to the kind of fundamental changes that are necessary at this time, and actually ultimately can take on a colonial aspect. So it's very delicate to say it's the entire institution, we're not fulfilling it, and students play a key role in the classroom and in demonstrations, and faculty play a key role in their teaching and research, and the community has to be our partner if we're going to do this. Does that help you answer the question, Trent? Okay.
Yes, definitely. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Professor Mino, please come in.
Yes, well, thank you very much for your very inspiring lecture. I'm also from Tokyo College. My name is Mino, and my question is related to this local global relationship. I think that is one of the key points in your lecture.
Yes, very much.
And for example, the University of Tokyo, which I belong to, is a local university in the sense that it's located in Japan. And then we accept many international students. So in that sense, we are international university.
Yes.
And then probably the meaning of local is different for each student who study in the University of Tokyo, and the meaning of local for the university. So my first question is, what do you mean by local? The meaning of local may be different for individual students and the universities. So this is one question. And another question is related to that. I would like to know your view on the language issue. That means, say in Japan, the University of Tokyo, we use Japanese as the common language for the university, but at the same time, we use English for teaching language. In this situation, say if we explain a certain thing in Japanese and in English, probably we try to explain the same thing, but the real meaning that may be carried through different languages may be different. And the language is very, very important medium for education.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you have any opinion on the language issue in general?
Right. That's great. Both great questions. So let me talk about local as I speak about it. And I want to make this clear. There is my university is an international university, and it has students from all over the United States and around the world. And Penn does. And but what I talk about local is regardless of where you're from, while you're on campus, your locality is your geographic or ecological community. It is the area, either it can be defined in different ways. In our case, it's neighborhoods in West Philadelphia. It's locality proximity, some degree of proximity. The argument is it's in that local interaction with communities that learning occurs powerfully, but it doesn't mean that if I'm a student and I'm studying in Penn, and I just had a student do this, and I'm going back to Nigeria, that I still, while I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, I still have roots and connections to Nigeria, but I'm doing local work in West Philadelphia, that then when I go back to my country, I can work locally there or in any other way. It's the idea that this is a powerful way to learn, do research, and to advance society and to make a difference. So locality is a more narrow definition than some would have, in the sense that I see it as geographically proximate, depends on what those boundaries are, vary. Could be a city, could be a region, could be a neighborhood. Our region of our neighborhood within the city has about 30,000 people. So I view that as our primary place of interaction, not exclusively, but primary. So that's what I would mean by locality. But then students who leave will in fact use it in the localities they're in. And while they're here at the university, we encourage them to continue their relationship to their communities that they initially were from, but it is different. The issue of language is very powerful. And the question of how that becomes part of the experience. One great problem in the United States, and I'm a very bad, unfortunate example of that, is that we are language illiterate in many ways. Unfortunately, when I go to meetings with my colleagues in Europe, I always feel, my God, I wish my education were different. I study Spanish, I love Spanish, but I didn't continue with it. And I have a very limited range of language activities. I think it's very important that students should be provided, first of all, understand if they're going to work in the locality, the language of the neighborhoods they're in, but they also should be able, depending upon their interest and trajectory, to have an acquaintance and knowledge of languages that they feel are important to them in their future. So I believe that very strongly. I'm not arguing that there's one focus solely, but it depends where the student wants to go, what the student wants to do. And it's very important, though, that if we're going to work in our communities, which that people who come from other countries and speak other languages, that they have a sense of the language of those neighborhoods and communities to be effective. So I think that's very important, very important.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I think it's really important to accept the diversity of language in the sense
Yes.
that all these different people think in
That's
different
absolutely.
But in order to communicate properly, I think one particular common language is also important.
Also useful. It depends on the setting and place. And I think the United States, there needs to be strong acceptance, which increasingly has happened, of people who speak Spanish, for instance, in communities. At the same time as they learn English and they're involved with that, but they're also holding on to their language. Their culture is very, very important, and it's part of America. It's part of the United States. So I agree with you. It's accepting, and it is useful to have common ways of communicating. And some of the common ways should be that people learn Spanish. I mean, that's very useful. In some places in the United States, that's the dominant population. So that becomes very important.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Ghalib Jebi from the South African Embassy in Tokyo. Over to you, Ghalib.
Thank you very much, Professor Bauer, and to our speaker. Very interesting presentation. I like the idea that universities is the heart of the education system. It produces the teachers. I think that's an important statement, and we need to recognize that it's certainly very important. Now, I'm a firm believer in the public good of higher education and universities. However, and I just want to understand, Ira, if there isn't a tension between trying to make universities financially sustainable on the one hand as institutions, and their desire to be part of the global academy, and to make them to respond to global challenges more effectively. Thanks.
So I think that's a terrific question. So the issue, is there a financial tension between doing what I would advocate for and in fact the actual needs for economic success of the institution? So I'm going to put it this way. I really do believe that certainly in the relatively medium run and long run, altruism pays better than any other money grubbing strategy. So to be very cynical, if I can even use that, besides the right values, that I think this is a way to increase university support from the public, from governmental and public authorities, and in the United States case, for individual givers. We've seen that in my own institution. The University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the elite universities in the United States, increased its relative standing by focusing on locality, at least more than others, not enough, but more than other elite schools. And among the ways that happened was individuals not only want to attend Penn, but individuals give money for the kind of work they do. I'm not saying that the Neti Center is an example. We are a crumb on the table of the Penn Medical Center in terms of size, but we bring in every year millions of dollars for the institution by the work we do, because individual donors and government provide support. So the idea that altruism pays powerfully, and that even in the short run, there may be financial costs, and I agree with that. But I think in the medium term and long term, it is a smart institutional advancement strategy. If we don't show our value for the public, we are in danger of losing our economic support. We are in danger of losing the monies that are given to us. And if we don't show that support, we don't have that support, we're in danger of being politically narrowed and depriving the institutions of openness and free speech and academic freedom, which is happening in the state of Florida. And part of it is you need the support of publics, which means to get that support, you need to be engaged. So I actually see what might be termed altruistic, public-spirited, public engagement as a smart strategy for, among other things, gaining resources for the institution.
Thank you so much. I mean, just to take that argument slightly forward, you've heard me say before, I think, that we also have to think about this form of engagement as a unique kind of venue, if you like, for genuine knowledge production, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
becomes a part of the.
And if it isn't that, it won't succeed. And that's a core function. One of the two functions, again, is the education of citizens, which and the production of knowledge to improve the world. And and that has to be at the heart of this type of work, at the heart.
Okay, so we're on the hour. So let me just say thank you so much again. I know it's late for you there, so thank you for staying up, and look forward to seeing you soon. Just for the participants, just to pay, next week on Wednesday, we have Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni from the University of Beirut in Germany. He's South African, but he's based there at the moment. And he's going to be talking about the politics of knowledge and the imperative of decolonization with a particular perspective from Africa. So that would be interesting because in some senses it will kind of raise some of the issues that I have spoken about today about local knowledges and so on. But just to say, next week it'll be at 3 o'clock Tokyo time, which makes it impossible for you, unfortunately. But thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.